You should really start thinking about moving somewhere smaller, my son Richard said, standing in the doorway of my kitchen. Looking around the room, the way people look at a hotel they don't plan to stay in long. I didn't answer right away. I was standing at the counter, slicing carrots, and the knife made that slow, steady sound against the wooden board, a soft, rhythmic tap that had filled this kitchen for more years than I could count. The late afternoon light came in pale through the window above the sink, the kind of winter light that makes everything look honest and a little tired at the same time. The kettle had just clicked off behind me, and the air smelled faintly of onions, celery, and the beginning of soup. Richard didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask how I was. He just stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone, and looked around my kitchen slowly, like he was measuring the space with his eyes. "You heard me, right?" he said after a moment. I set the knife down, carefully, lined it up with the edge of the cutting board the way I always do, and wiped my hands on the dish towel. I don't know why I always do that before serious conversations. Maybe it makes me feel prepared, like I've finished one task and can now deal with the next. "I heard you," I said. "I'm just trying to understand why you're saying it." He sighed, not loudly, but the way people sigh when they think they are about to explain something obvious to someone who just isn't being practical. "Mum, this house is too big for you," he said. "Too many rooms, too many stairs, too much maintenance. It just doesn't make sense anymore. You should sell it and move somewhere smaller. Somewhere easier. Easier." I turned slightly and looked around my kitchen. The yellow curtains over the sink were the same ones I had sewn myself years ago. The cabinet handle near the stove was still a little loose because Henry had fixed it 3 times and it kept coming loose again. The clock on the wall was 5 minutes fast because Richard used to be late for school, and I thought it would help him if the house itself pushed him out the door a little earlier. Nothing in this kitchen was expensive. Nothing in this kitchen was new, but every single thing in it had a memory attached to it. "This house has been making sense for me for over 40 years, I said quietly. He walked into the kitchen then and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms like he was settling in for a conversation he had already planned in his head. "That was different," he said. "You were younger then. Now it's just not practical. You should simplify things. Move into a condo. Or one of those retirement communities. They have nice ones now. Clean, safe, no yard work, no stairs. It would be better for you. Better for you." That's what people say when they are about to change your life and want it to sound like a favor. I walked over to the stove and stirred the soup slowly. The steam rose up and fogged my glasses, and I had to take them off and wipe them with the corner of my sweater. For a few seconds, everything in the kitchen looked blurry, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I could still move around that kitchen perfectly, even when I couldn't see it clearly. That's what happens when you live somewhere long enough. You don't need to see where things are. You just know. "When did you start thinking about this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Sandra and I have been talking about it for a while." For a while. I nodded slowly and kept stirring the soup, even though it didn't need stirring anymore. "And in all those conversations," I said, "did it ever occur to you to include me?" He shifted his weight and uncrossed his arms. "Mom, don't make it sound like we're doing something behind your back," he said quickly. "We're just trying to plan ahead, for the future. The future. It's a strange thing when people start planning your future like you are a piece of furniture that needs to be moved before they can rearrange the room." I turned the stove off and placed the lid on the pot. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet, without the sound of simmering. I could hear the refrigerator humming and a car passing slowly outside. "And what does this future look like?" I asked. "The one you and Sandra are planning." He hesitated for just a second, just long enough for me to notice. "Well," he said, "you'd sell the house, and with that money you could get a really nice apartment. Smaller, safer, easier to manage. And you'd be closer to us, so we could help you if you need anything. If I need anything, I almost smiled at that, but I didn't. Because I couldn't remember the last time I had asked them for anything, but I could remember very clearly the last time they had asked me for something. Actually, I could remember many times, but that wasn't the conversation we were having. Not yet. Instead, I asked him a very simple question. Richard, I said, are you worried about me, or are you worried about this house? He looked at me, and for the first time since he walked in, he didn't have an immediate answer. That's not fair, he said finally. We're talking about what's best for you. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. My knees had been bothering me that week, and standing for too long made my back ache. Age does that, it reminds you of every year you've lived, one joint at a time. What's best for me, I repeated slowly, is to live in my home. The home your father and I paid for. The home I maintained. The home I still pay taxes on. The home I still clean, cook in, sleep in, and take care of every single day. He ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had when he was frustrated. He used to do that when he was a teenager and couldn't solve a math problem. Mom, you're being emotional, he said. I'm trying to be practical. Emotional. That word again. I noticed something in that moment that I hadn't noticed clearly before. When I talked about memories, I was emotional. When I talked about the house, I was emotional. When I talked about staying, I was emotional. But when he talked about selling my house, moving me out, and planning my future, he was being practical. I folded my hands on the table and looked at him for a long moment. And as I looked at him, I realized something very quietly inside my chest. He wasn't asking me a question. He was presenting a decision. He thought this was already decided. He thought this was just a conversation where I would slowly agree. He thought I would say, well, maybe you're right. He thought I would start packing my life into boxes because he had decided it was time. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with anger. Just a small, quiet shift in the way I was looking at the man standing in my kitchen. Richard, I said finally, very calmly, I will think about what you said. He looked relieved. Actually relieved. Good, he said. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. We just want what's best for you. We. That word again. He stayed for dinner that night. I served the soup, and we ate at the same table where he used to sit when his legs were too short to reach the floor. He talked about work, about traffic, about the price of gas, about his son's school, about Sandra's new job. He did not talk about the house again. But he didn't need to, because once someone says a thing like that out loud, it doesn't leave the room. It sits there quietly, like an extra person at the table. You don't see it, but you feel it. In the hallway, on the stairs, in your bedroom, in your thoughts when you turn off the lights. That night, after he left, I walked through the house slowly before going to bed. I touched the back of the sofa Henry used to fall asleep on. I straightened the picture frame in the hallway. I turned off the light in the laundry room. I checked the lock on the back door twice, out of habit. And as I stood in the living room with only the small lamp on by the window, I realized something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. When people start talking about your life like it is an inconvenience, they are not worried about you. They are worried about what you own. I didn't say anything to Richard that night. I didn't argue. I didn't call anyone. I didn't make a scene. But I remember standing there in the quiet house, looking at the walls we had painted, the furniture we had chosen, the life we had built, and thinking one very clear thought. I didn't know it yet, but that was the day everything started to change. After that conversation, nothing changed. And somehow, everything changed. Richard didn't bring up the house again right away, not directly. But something had shifted in the way he spoke to me, in the way Sandra looked around the rooms, in the way conversations paused for half a second when I entered. It was subtle. The kind of subtle you can ignore if you want to keep the peace. And for most of my life, I had been very good at keeping the peace. My days were simple and quiet, and I liked them that way. I woke up around 6:30 every morning, usually before the sun in winter. The house always sounded different at that hour. Old houses have their own language. The soft ticking of heating pipes, a faint creak in the hallway, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen like it's thinking about something. I would put the kettle on and stand by the window while the water heated. Outside, the street was usually empty, except for one man who walked his dog every morning at exactly the same time. We never spoke, but we always nodded to each other through the glass like two people who understood quiet routines. Then I would sit at the kitchen table with my tea and a small notebook where I wrote down expenses: electric bill, water bill, property tax, insurance, groceries, gas, medication, small repairs. I wrote everything down carefully in the same neat columns I had been using for years. Not because I had to. I could afford my life, but because writing things down makes you aware of what things cost. And when you know what things cost, you understand what things are worth. Around 9, I would clean one part of the house. At my age, you don't clean the whole house in one day anymore. You do the living room on Monday, the kitchen on Tuesday, the bathroom on Wednesday. Slow, steady work. The kind that keeps a house and a life in order. Twice a week I went to the grocery store. I still compared prices. I still looked for sales. I still bought things Richard liked when he was a boy. A certain cereal, a certain soup out of habit, I suppose. Old habits are like old furniture. You don't throw them away just because no one notices them anymore. Richard and Sandra visited often, not to see how I was doing, but because my house was on the way to many other places. They would come in quickly, talking about their day, their bills, their problems, their plans. Sandra would walk into the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and look inside like she was checking inventory. "You still buy this brand?" she said once, holding up a carton of orange juice. "It's expensive. You should shop where I shop. You could save money." I was standing at the sink, rinsing a cup. "I'm all right," I said. "I can afford my orange juice." She laughed a little, like I had made a small joke, but I wasn't joking. Richard often sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and used my internet for work calls because, as he said, "It's quieter here." Sometimes he took calls in the living room, walking back and forth like the house was an office he owned. Sometimes they stayed for dinner. Sometimes they took food home in containers. Sometimes they borrowed things and forgot to bring them back. And every time they left, the house felt a little quieter than before. Not peaceful quiet. More like the quiet after guests leave a hotel room. Everything slightly out of place, the air a little different. One evening, Sandra stood in the living room, turning slowly in a circle, looking at the walls, the windows, the staircase. "You know," she said, "if this place was renovated a little, it could be worth a lot more. New floors, new kitchen, open up that wall." People love open concepts now. I was sitting in my chair by the window, knitting a scarf I would probably never finish. "This wall," I said, "your father-in-law built with his own hands." She smiled politely, the way people smile when history is not important to them. "Yes, but buyers don't care about that kind of thing," she said. "They care about resale value." Resale value. I noticed she said buyers. Not family, not memories, not history. Buyers. Another time, Richard came by alone. He had that careful look on his face, the one he used when he was about to ask for something, but wanted to make it sound reasonable. "Mom," he said, sitting down at the table, "you know property taxes are going up again this year, right?" "Yes," I said. I saw the notice. He nodded slowly. "And maintenance, and utilities, and insurance. Houses are expensive to keep. It might not make sense for you to keep carrying all that alone. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I've been carrying it alone for a very long time, Richard, I said. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he looked around the kitchen, at the cabinets, the floor, the ceiling, like he was calculating something. If you sold, he said, you could invest the money, live comfortably, no stress, no maintenance, just easy living, easy living. It's interesting how people start offering you an easy life right around the time they start calculating what your current life is worth. But the moment that stayed with me the most was a Sunday afternoon. They had all come over, Richard, Sandra, the kids. I had cooked a full meal, more than I should have, but I still cook like I'm feeding a house full of people. Roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread. The kitchen was warm, the windows slightly fogged, the table too full like always. After dinner, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard Sandra's voice from the living room. I wasn't trying to listen, but when you live in a house for 40 years, you know how sound travels. This would be perfect for us, you know, she said. So much space. The yard is huge, the neighborhood is good, and it's already paid off. Richard said something I couldn't hear clearly. Then Sandra said, very clearly, by the time we actually get this house, we should redo the kitchen first. That's the only room that really needs updating. I stood there, at the sink, with my hands in warm water, holding one of my own plates, and listened to my daughter-in-law plan renovations for a house I was still living in. Not if they got the house. When? I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly, very slowly, and stood there looking at the kitchen, at the curtains I had sewn, at the table Henry had sanded and varnished himself, at the cabinet where I still kept Richard's school drawings, at the small crack in the tile near the stove that had been there for 15 years. And I realized something very quietly, very clearly. They were not visiting me anymore. They were visiting the house, and I was just the person who opened the door. I didn't say anything that night. I packed the leftovers into containers for them to take home, just like always. Sandra thanked me for dinner. Richard kissed me on the cheek. The grandchildren said goodbye and ran to the car. Everything looked normal. But as I closed the front door and turned the lock, I stood there for a long moment, with my hand still on the key. Because I understood something now that I had not allowed myself to understand before. They were not waiting for me to be ready. They were waiting for me to be gone. And I didn't say anything. But that was the moment I started paying very close attention. Hello, my friends. It's Thomas. Let's pause here for a moment, because this part of the story is important, and I want you to really think about it. Our friend Eleanor is not irresponsible. She is not careless. She is not a woman who made bad decisions and lost control of her life. She paid for her home. She maintained it. She paid the taxes, the insurance, the repairs. She cooked the meals, hosted the holidays, helped her family when they needed help, and asked for very little in return. And yet, slowly, over the years, something very common began to happen. Not shouting, not fighting, not one big dramatic betrayal. Something quieter than that. Entitlement. The kind that grows slowly in families when one person is always the responsible one. The one who pays when things go wrong. The one who hosts every holiday. The one who keeps the family together. The one who says, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." After many years, people stop saying thank you. After many years, people stop asking. After many years, people start assuming. And assumptions are very dangerous things inside families, because they don't feel like greed when you're the one making them. They feel like planning. They feel like being practical. They feel like this is how things will be one day anyway. Tell me honestly, have you ever seen something like this in a family? Where one person becomes the helper, the problem solver, the quiet provider, and slowly, over time, everyone starts building their future on that person's life. At what point does help become expectation? At what point does love become entitlement? And at what point does silence become permission? Think about that for a moment. Because what happened next in my life didn't start with an argument. It started with a very quiet morning and a stack of envelopes on my kitchen table. That was the morning I realized something that changed everything. I didn't know it yet, but that was the morning I stopped being managed and started being in control. The realization didn't come during an argument. It didn't come when Richard told me I should move. It didn't come when Sandra talked about renovating my kitchen. It didn't even come when I heard them talking about when they got the house. It came on a very ordinary morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my robe with a cup of tea and a stack of envelopes. The sun was just coming up, and the light was falling across the table in that pale blue way it does in winter, making everything look quiet and serious. The house was completely still. Even the refrigerator had stopped humming for a moment, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. I opened each envelope one by one and placed them in a neat line in front of me. Electric bill, water bill, property tax, insurance, internet, gas. I had been opening envelopes like that for most of my adult life. First when Henry was alive, and then alone after he was gone. Bills don't stop when people die. If anything, they become quieter and more regular, like the world is reminding you that life is now a series of responsibilities you carry by yourself. I took out my checkbook and began writing checks slowly, carefully, the way I always do. I wrote the date, I wrote the amount, I wrote the name, I wrote the memo. I tore each check out neatly and placed it on top of the envelope it belonged to. When I finished, I sat there for a long time looking at the total. Then I looked around the kitchen, at the cabinets, at the table, at the floor, at the walls, at the clock, at the small crack in the ceiling above the window that had been there since 1998. And a very simple thought entered my mind. Everything in this house exists because I paid for it. The house, the repairs, the taxes, the furniture, the food, the holidays, the help I gave Richard, the help I gave his children, the money I lent, the bills I covered when things went wrong for them. All of it. Me. And then the second thought came, even quieter than the first. If I paid for everything, why was everyone else making decisions about it? I sat there for a long time with that thought. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there and let that thought settle into the room like another piece of furniture that had always belonged there, but I had never really noticed. And then, for the first time in many years, I asked myself a question I should have asked a long time ago. What would happen if I stopped helping everyone else and started protecting myself instead? The question didn't feel cruel. It didn't feel selfish. It didn't even feel brave. It just felt necessary. I looked at the stack of envelopes, the checkbook, the quiet kitchen, the early morning light, and I realized something very clearly. I was not a guest in this house. I was not a dependent. I was not a problem that needed to be managed. I was the owner, and that was the moment everything changed. Not outside. Outside, everything still looked the same. The same house, the same street, the same family, the same routine. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer thinking like a mother who was trying to keep everyone happy. I was starting to think like a woman who was trying to protect her life. And those are two very different ways of thinking. I finished my tea, washed the cup, and dried it slowly. Then I walked to the hallway closet, looked at the door for a moment, and reached for the handle. Because I suddenly remembered something important. There were documents in this house. Documents that had my name on them, and I had a feeling those documents were about to become very important. When you live in the same house for more than 40 years, you don't just collect furniture and photographs, you collect paperwork. Old houses have drawers and boxes that become quiet archives of a life, envelopes with fading ink, folders with labels written in different versions of your own handwriting. Documents you don't look at for years because you think you will never need them again. That afternoon, after I came home from the bank, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't make tea. I didn't call Richard. I went straight to the hallway closet. At the bottom of that closet, behind a box of Christmas decorations and an old vacuum cleaner I no longer used, there was a dark green metal file box. Henry had bought it sometime in the 1980s. It still had a small dent on the corner from when we moved it, during a kitchen renovation many years ago. I carried it to the dining room table and sat down. The house was very quiet. So quiet that I could hear the clock in the living room ticking, 1 second at a time, steady and patient. I remember thinking that the house had heard every conversation, every argument, every celebration, every silence for decades. And now it was listening again. I opened the file box and began taking out folders one by one, laying them neatly on the table. House deed, mortgage paid in full, insurance policies, tax records, Henry's will, my will, investment accounts, bank documents, property tax receipts. I opened the folder marked House Deed first. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed at the edges, the way important documents always are. Henry and I had signed it together the year we finished paying off the mortgage. I ran my fingers slowly over the paper until they reached the signatures. His name, my name, owners, not future owners, not shared with children, not promised to anyone. Owners, I read the document carefully. Then I read it again, slower the second time. Legal language is very calm language. It doesn't care about feelings. It only cares about facts. And the fact was very simple. The house belonged to me. I placed the deed aside and opened the folder marked Henry's will. Henry had been a very organized man. Not emotional, not dramatic, just organized. The kind of man who labeled cables, kept instruction manuals, and wrote dates on the back of photographs. When he prepared his will, he did it the same way he did everything else, carefully and clearly. If he passed away first, everything went to me. If I passed away later, everything would be distributed according to my will. Not Richard's decisions, not Sandra's plans, my will. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the dining room. The wooden cabinet Henry built was still against the wall. The table still had a small burn mark from a candle we knocked over decades ago. The curtains were slightly faded from years of sunlight. This was not just a house. This was a life that had been built slowly, bill by bill, repair by repair, year by year. Nothing in this house had appeared magically. Everything had been paid for with time, work, and patience. And legally, not emotionally, not morally, but legally, it all still belonged to me. I opened the folder marked My Will. I hadn't looked at it in years. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I trusted that it had been done properly, and I didn't think I would need to change it anytime soon. Richard's name was there. Of course it was. He was my only son. But as I sat there reading that document in the quiet dining room, I realized something very important. A will is not a gift. A will is a decision, and decisions can be changed. I closed the folder slowly and placed both hands flat on the table. The wood felt cool under my palms. I could hear a car passing outside, tires on the road, then silence again. And in that quiet room, I said something out loud, even though no one else was there to hear it. I am not powerless, I said. The words sounded strange in the room, like they had been waiting a long time to be spoken. That was the moment the fear left. Not all at once, but enough. In its place came something much more useful than fear. Clarity. I went to the kitchen, took a small notepad from the drawer, and came back to the table. I sat down, clicked a pen, and began to write a list. Not an emotional list, not an angry list, a practical list. Things that needed to be done. Things that should have been done earlier. Things that I was going to do now. I wrote slowly, thinking carefully about each line. When I finished, I looked at the list for a long time. Then I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. Because for the first time since that conversation in the kitchen, I was no longer the woman they were planning around. I was the woman who was planning. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always did, 6:30. The house was quiet, the way it always is, just before the day properly begins. The heating pipes clicked softly in the walls, and the sky outside the bedroom window was that pale grey-blue colour that comes just before sunrise. For a few minutes, I lay there and listened to the house. When you live somewhere long enough, you can tell when something feels different, even if nothing has actually changed yet. I got up, made the bed, washed my face, and went to the kitchen. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and took the folded piece of paper out of my pocket. I smoothed it out on the table and read the list again while the water heated. 7 things. 7 quiet, practical things. I made tea, sat down, and started with the first phone call. The lawyer. His name was Daniel Harper. He had been a junior associate at the firm that handled Henry's will years ago. I didn't know if he would remember me, but when his receptionist answered, I gave my name and said, "He helped my husband and me with estate documents many years ago." There was a brief pause, the soft sound of typing, and then she said, "One moment, please." A minute later, a man came on the line. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "Of course I remember you. How are you?" "I'm well," I said. "But I think it's time I reviewed some documents, and I would prefer to do it sooner rather than later." He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Good lawyers don't do that on the phone. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I can." When I hung up, I sat there for a moment, looking at the steam rising from my tea. My hands were steady. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel nervous making that call, but I didn't. I felt organized. The next call was to the bank. I would like to open a new account, I told Mr. Collins. In my name only, and I would like to transfer the majority of my savings into that account. "Of course," he said. "We can prepare everything for you today. And I would like written confirmation," I added, "that my son no longer has access to any of my accounts." There was a small pause on the line. Then he said, very professionally, "I understand. We will take care of it." After I hung up, I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and left it in the sink. I went to my room and got dressed. Not in anything special. Just a simple dark blue dress, a grey coat, and the small gold earrings Henry gave me on our 25th anniversary. I don't know why I chose those earrings that day. Maybe because they reminded me that there was a time when someone stood beside me and not across from me. At the bank, everything was very polite and very quiet. Forms were printed. Documents were signed. Accounts were transferred. Addresses were corrected. Online access was changed. New statements were set to be mailed only to my house. Mr. Collins placed a folder in front of me when we were finished. "Everything is now in your name only," he said, "and these are copies of all the changes." I placed my hand on the folder for a moment before picking it up. "Thank you," I said. Then I asked him one more question. "If someone had planned to slowly move money out of my accounts," I said calmly, "how difficult will it be for them to do that now?" He understood the question immediately. "Very difficult," he said. "Without your permission, they will not be able to access anything." I nodded. "Good," I said. "That's what I wanted to know." The next morning, I drove to the lawyer's office. The sky was clear, the air cold, and the sun was low and bright in that way it is in winter, when everything looks sharp and exposed. Law offices always smell the same paper, coffee, and carpet that has been cleaned too many times. Mr. Harper greeted me himself and led me into a conference room with a long wooden table and a window that looked out over a parking lot. We sat down, and I placed my folders on the table. "I would like to review my will," I said, "and I would also like to confirm the ownership status of my house." He opened the folders and began reading quietly. Lawyers read very carefully. They don't rush, they don't assume. They read every word like it might change something important. After about 20 minutes, he looked up. "Your house is in your name alone," he said. "Free and clear. No liens, no shared ownership, no transfer on death deed. It belongs entirely to you." I felt my shoulders relax slightly, but I did not smile. "And my will?" I asked. "It leaves the majority of your estate to your son," he said, "with some smaller provisions for your granddaughter." I folded my hands on the table and looked at the papers for a long moment before speaking. "I would like to change that," I said. He did not look surprised. He did not ask why. Good lawyers understand that the reasons are usually personal and not necessary for the paperwork. "How would you like it changed?" he asked. "I would like to place the house and the majority of my assets into a trust," I said slowly. "And I would like my granddaughter Sophie to be the primary beneficiary of that trust." He nodded and began writing notes. "And your son?" he asked. "He will still be in the will," I said. "But not in control of anything. Not the house, not the accounts, not the trust. Mister." Harper looked at me for a moment. Then he said something very simple. "That is a very wise decision," he said. We spent the next 2 hours going over documents. Trust documents, power of attorney, medical directives, property protections, a new will, instructions about the house. What would happen now? What would happen later? What no one else would be able to do without my permission. When everything was ready, he placed the documents neatly in front of me and turned them so they faced my chair. "Once these are signed and filed," he said, "no one will be able to make decisions about your property or finances except you." I picked up the pen and signed every page slowly, carefully, the same way I had signed checks, school forms, permission slips, and tax returns for most of my life. But this time, I was not signing something for someone else. I was signing something for myself. When I left the lawyer's office, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, and the light was golden on the tops of the buildings. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine and just looked at my hands on the steering wheel. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt safe. Not because someone was protecting me, but because I was protecting myself. And they didn't know it yet, but things were about to change. The first sign that something had changed came on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard arrived without calling first, which was not unusual. He still had his key, and I heard the front door open and close while I was in the living room folding laundry. The television was on low, some afternoon program I wasn't really watching, and a small square of sunlight had moved across the carpet and was now touching the leg of the coffee table. "Mum," he called out, "are you home?" "I'm in the living room," I replied. He walked in holding his phone in his hand, and I could tell immediately from the look on his face that something had not gone the way he expected. "Did you change something at the bank?" he asked. I folded one of my sweaters slowly and placed it on the neat stack beside me before answering. I didn't rush. I didn't look nervous. I just finished what I was doing. "Yes," I said. "I did." He stared at me for a moment, like he was waiting for a longer explanation that wasn't coming. "I tried to log into your account to move some money for the property tax," he said, "and my access is gone." "I know," I said. "I removed it." He blinked, clearly surprised by how simple the answer was. "Why would you do that?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "Because it's my account, Richard." He let out a short breath and ran his hand through his hair. "Mum, I was helping you," he said. "We talked about this. I was managing things so you wouldn't have to worry about it." I picked up another piece of laundry and folded it carefully along the seams. "I am not worried about my accounts," I said. "I am worried about people having access to them without my supervision." His expression changed then, not angry yet, but something tighter, something more serious. You don't trust me? He asked. I held his gaze and answered very calmly. Not with my money, no. The room went very quiet after that. Even the television seemed too loud. So I reached for the remote and turned it off. The silence that followed felt very clear, like a room after someone opens a window. He shifted his weight and looked around the living room, at the furniture, the walls, the staircase, the same way he had looked at the kitchen that day. Sandra and I have been trying to help you, he said. We've been trying to make things easier for you, and this is the thanks we get? I almost smiled at that sentence, but I didn't, because I had heard that sentence before, in different forms, at different times in life. It is a very common sentence when people stop benefiting from your generosity. This is not about thanks, I said. This is about ownership. Ownership, he repeated. Yes, I said. My accounts, my house, my decisions. He stared at me like he was seeing me slightly differently for the first time. You've been talking to someone, he said. Yes, I said. I have. A lawyer, he asked. Yes. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Mom, this is getting ridiculous, he said. We're your family. Why are you acting like we're strangers? I folded the last sweater and placed it on the stack, then rested my hands in my lap. Because strangers don't usually try to move money out of my accounts without telling me, I said. His face went pale. I wasn't stealing from you, he said quickly. I was just moving money around, for bills, for expenses, for the house. You were moving money, I said, from my accounts to accounts I did not control, and the statements were being mailed to your house. Not mine. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out for a moment. I went to the bank, Richard, I said quietly. I saw everything. He sat down then, slowly, like his legs suddenly didn't feel very strong. You don't understand, he said. I was just trying to organize things. You're getting older. Someone has to manage this stuff. I nodded once. And that someone, I said, is me. He sat there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, Sandra is not going to like this. I looked at him and said, Sandra does not have to like what I do with my money or my house. He stood up then and walked to the window, looking out at the yard. His hands were on his hips, the way his father used to stand when he was trying to figure out a problem. After a moment, he said something that told me everything I needed to know. We were counting on that house, he said quietly. Not we were worried about you. Not we want you to be safe. Not we love you. We were counting on that house. I nodded slowly. I know, I said. He turned around and looked at me. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I said calmly, that you and Sandra made plans for something that did not belong to you. And now? He asked. And now, I said, those plans will have to change. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just stood there in the middle of the living room, looking like a man who had just realized that a door he thought was open was actually locked. And that was only the first conversation. The real change came over the next few weeks. Richard and Sandra came to the house together a few days later. This time, Sandra spoke first. She didn't sit down. She didn't take her coat off. Richard says you've been moving money and changing legal documents without talking to us, she said. That is correct, I said. She blinked, clearly not expecting such a simple answer. Why would you do that? She asked. Because it is my money and my legal documents, I said. Richard stepped in then, his voice tighter than I had ever heard it. Mum, you put the house in a trust, he asked. Yes, I said. Why would you do that? He asked again. So that everything is clear and protected, I said. Sandra crossed her arms. Protected from who? She asked. I looked at her and answered very calmly. From confusion, I said. That made her angry. You're being manipulated, she said. Someone is putting ideas in your head. This is not normal. Families don't do this to each other. I nodded slowly. You're right, I said. Families should not have to do this to each other. The room went very quiet after that. Richard walked into the dining room and came back holding the green file box. He opened it and started flipping through folders, the deed, the trust documents, the will copies. I watched him read the words that changed his expectations. Trust, beneficiary, sole control, property held in trust. He looked up at me slowly. Sophie? He said. You put Sophie as the primary beneficiary? Yes, I said. She is the only person in this family who has never once asked me for money, access, control, or this house. Sandra's face turned red. This is unbelievable, she said. After everything we've done for you, I interrupted her very gently. What exactly have you done for me? I asked. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard tried a different approach then. His voice became softer, almost like when he was a boy and trying to talk his way out of trouble. Mom, he said, we were just trying to plan ahead. We thought eventually we would move in here. Take care of the place. Keep it in the family. It is in the family, I said. Just not under your control. He stared at me for a long time. You're serious, he said finally. Yes, I said. I am. And what happens now? He asked. Now nothing changes, I said. I live here. I pay my bills. I take care of my house, just like I always have. And the house? Sandra asked. What happens to the house? I looked at her and said something I had thought about very carefully before saying out loud. That depends, I said, on how I am treated for the rest of my life. They didn't say anything after that, because for the first time, they understood something very clearly. The future they had already planned was no longer theirs to plan. The final changes were completed about a month later. The trust was finalized. The new will was signed and filed. My accounts were in my name only. All statements came to my house. All decisions required my signature, and only my signature. Very quiet changes, but very powerful ones. Richard and Sandra stopped coming by as often after that. When they did visit, they called first. They knocked. They sat where guests sit, not where owners sit. They spoke to me differently, not warmer, not kinder, but more careful. And it is a strange thing when your own children start speaking to you carefully. But it is also a very clear thing. Careful means they understand something now that they did not understand before. They understand boundaries. They understand ownership. They understand that the future is not something you take. It is something that is given. I still live in the same house. I still wake up at 6:30. I still make tea. I still write my expenses in a small notebook. I still cook too much soup. I still clean one room at a time. I still sit by the window in the evening when the light turns soft and the street gets quiet. From the outside, my life probably looks exactly the same as it did before, but it isn't. Because there is a big difference between living in a house that people are waiting to inherit and living in a house that you control. I did not do what I did to punish my son. I did it because I finally understood something that took me most of my life to understand. Love and ownership are not the same thing. Family and entitlement are not the same thing. Kindness and permission are not the same thing. For most of my life, I was Richard's mother. Now, I am something else as well. I am the woman who owns this house. And those two things can exist at the same time, but only if everyone understands the difference. I still see my granddaughter, Sophie. She comes by sometimes and sits with me in the kitchen while I cook. She never talks about the house. She never talks about money. She asks me about recipes, about her grandfather, about what her father was like when he was little. One day she said to me, "Grandma, this house feels peaceful." I looked around the kitchen at the curtains, the table, the old clock, the late afternoon light, and I realized why. It's peaceful, I told her, because no one here is waiting for someone else to leave. And that, more than anything, is what this story is about. Not revenge, not money, not even the house. It's about something very simple: respect. And sometimes respect is not something you ask for. Sometimes it is something you quietly put into legal documents and sign your name under.